Mabuhay and welcome to ECOSS's Sustainable Futures Fest. Ako po si Monique Tixon at itong taon naging isang board member for ECOSS. Hello and welcome to ECOSS's Sustainable Futures Fest. My name is Monique Tixon and I recently became a board member for ECOSS. I was inspired to join the board because ECOSS's mission to focus on educating diverse and historically marginalized communities strongly aligns with my personal principles and values. I have always been a passionate supporter for promoting social justice in education, the workplace, and the environment. Before we get into the festival activities, it is important to acknowledge that ECOSS and many of the people who ECOSS serves reside on the traditional lands of the Coast Salish people, including the Duwamish people. While ECOSS works with underserved communities to create sustainable solutions for all, it is important to recognize the original stewards of this land and their descendants who continue to care for this land. You can learn about the indigenous peoples of your region by going to native-land.ca. Over these 3 days, we will be featuring discussions and stories around environmental sustainability and justice from ECOSS as well as other local environmental leaders. As a community-based nonprofit, we rely on your donations to fund environmental outreach and assistance that serves communities and businesses in need. Throughout this event, you can show your support by texting SFF 2021 to 202-858-1233 or by visiting ecoss.org. And don't forget to register for the daily giveaway at givebutter.com/ECOSSfest2021. No donation required to be entered for a chance to receive a $50 gift card for a local BIPOC-owned restaurant. Now I'd like to introduce today's panel discussion on just and sustainable futures. ECOSS is recognized as a leader in building bridges among government, communities, and businesses. For this panel, we brought together a few of the individuals we work with to talk about the region's opportunities for advancing environmental justice. I will now pass the mic off to ECOSS's communications manager, Will Chen, who will introduce the panelists. We hope you will enjoy the discussion.
Thank you and welcome everybody. It is my pleasure to introduce the Just and Sustainable Futures panel that you have here today. And before we get into the conversation, I want to give an opportunity for everyone to introduce themselves.
Hi, everyone. Very happy to be here. My name is Joycelyn Chui, and I'm a transplant from Hong Kong, and I wear multiple hats. I'm actually an ECOSS alumni, so always happy to be back. During my time at ECOSS, I work extensively with local small businesses on topics like solid waste, food waste, stormwater pollution prevention and management, just to name a few. And ECOSS is very dear to my heart because it brought all the theories I learned from college to life, and it's also where I realized we need to approach the climate crisis we're facing more holistically, which led me to return to school. And right now I am pursuing a graduate program in the School of Public Health at University of Washington, focusing on environmental and occupational health sciences. Most recently, I also started my small consulting business that aims to intervene our climate issues with an upstream approach. So I can say I'm a small business owner too. That's a little bit about myself, and I will pass it on to Syris.
Thank you so much, Joycelyn. Hey, everyone. It's great to be here. My name is Syris Valentine. I also wear multiple hats. Today, though, I'm wearing my hat as a writer, focusing on climate justice and climate technology issues, and also as just a general climate justice advocate and community organizer in those spaces. Outside of that, I work also with Africatown Community Land Trust as a project manager around issues related to affordable housing, and also those intersections, the associated intersections with climate justice and environmental justice. And right now, I'm actually working on a project with ECOSS in collaboration, doing some work around community outreach towards transportation electrification. And then I'm also a co-chair for the Green New Deal Oversight Board of the City of Seattle, which I'm quite excited about, but definitely not speaking in that capacity here, 100% speaking as an individual and not representing either the board or Africatown Community Land Trust. Yeah, and I'm really excited to be here with both of these just wonderful organizers and excited to have this conversation. And I'll pass it to Lylianna.
Thank you, Syris. I'm excited to be here too. Lylianna Allala, she, her pronouns. My paid job is the Climate Justice Director at the Office of Sustainability and Environment over at the City of Seattle. And I also have many hats and cloaks and robes and all the accessories that I wear as well out in my community. But today I'll be speaking from my perspective as the Climate Justice Director. I'm really glad to be here and want to thank ECOSS and Will for the invitation. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. You've all kind of mentioned the climate crisis in your introductions. And I think that is something that's on a lot of our minds, especially with in the last couple of years, the pandemic is on everyone's minds. Racial justice and racial equity has really come to the fore. And one of the things that I wanted to touch upon that connects all of these is, what does the region need? What does the region need to address and to adapt to this climate crisis that we're in? What kind of support do BIPOC communities and businesses need in order to be able to lead in that change?
I can start, and I'll start with what is first coming to mind to me around rethinking our relationship with each other and ourselves, and with Mother Earth, rethinking and reimagining our commitment and agreement to being dynamic human beings as part of multiple communities, and reevaluating what it means to live in a manner that takes care of our people and our planet. So that to me really anchors me in the why I do my work and what excites me in doing my work, and what I think foundationally we need to do in order to address the climate crisis. I think I'll tee this up for my colleagues in the sense that I also think it means that we need to be reimagining what it means to redistribute wealth and power, and examine the systems that we work, live, play, pray, operate in. So I'll step back because I know my colleagues here will have much more to say.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I feel like, to Lylianna's point, the redistribution of wealth, land, and resources is probably one of the biggest things that really needs to happen to ensure that like BIPOC communities are able to lead the change that needs to happen, especially thinking about the systems that really created the crisis that we're in today, which are all to a large degree based around the sort of centralization of power, wealth, and resources into the hands of a select few, who then are able to dictate the direction of development and the way those resources are utilized, particularly for the enrichment of themselves and the few like select folks that are in that same circle. And that sort of inherent profit motive through extraction and the centralization of wealth and resources is really what has at like a fundamental level has created like the climate crisis and leads to this sort of incessant need to extract and pollute with and to continue to like grow our societies and whatnot, and sort of shifting how those resources are controlled and how their use is dictated, I think is fundamentally necessary to like making sure we get sufficient change and putting that power in the hands of communities who have historically deeper ties to the land, which is like Black African folks as well as Indigenous communities, because that environmental ethic is very much built into and baked into the cultures that our communities have developed historically and how always held dear to ourselves. To Lylianna's point as well about like the need to sort of like shift the way we think about our relationships with land.
Wonderful. I guess to add on, my first thought was we have to support the Green New Deal, number one, and start using the just transition framework to think about how we make decisions and basically incorporate it in our projects, what we do with communities. I think one thing I want to highlight is we should start looking at fulfilling people's basic needs first before we even talk about the climate crisis, such as equitable housing, healthcare, transportation, minimum wage, ability to pay for basic needs. Because if we want to engage communities in these conversations, make sure they have a seat at the table, I can't make somebody do that if they can barely put food on the table for their family, right? So we got to approach it with making sure their basic needs are met, and then engage them for topic like climate change and everything.
Can I add to what you were just saying, Joycelyn?
Yeah.
Because I feel like what you said is absolutely true. Like there is a need to make sure we're addressing people's basic needs so they have the capacity to even like think about what the climate is going to be like in 5 or 10 or 20 years from now. Because if you're just worrying about your day-to-day survival, it's very difficult to think about those long-term horizons that a lot of folks are talking about in terms of climate change right now. One of the really important actions that can be taken if we're strategic with how we're using like resources available to us is trying to use the sort of like addressing of these basic needs as a way of like reducing carbon emissions and whatnot. So thinking about how we do like regenerative agriculture in urban environments to make sure that folks are able to get easy access to healthy, fresh foods, but then also like quality jobs through that as well, and building new businesses and whatnot. And there's a lot of different approaches that I think can bridge that gap where we're addressing basic needs while addressing the climate crisis at the same time.
I love that. Yes. So basically, we want to build an economy that supports people's well-being. That can be health, financial well-being, everything. That centers around adapting to climate crisis, centering environmental health. Yeah.
For those in the audience who aren't as familiar with the Green New Deal or the Just Transition, I wonder if any of you could say a bit more.
I can maybe start with the Green New Deal. I think many of us have some personal ties to this work, and there's the national movement as well. So I'll focus on Seattle and say this is a grassroots-led effort that is meant to highlight the fact that we are still missing the mark when it comes to greenhouse gas emission reduction. We still have, like Joycelyn said, folks that are struggling to pay their bills, struggling with transportation and housing, with their utility bills, and folks who are interested in having jobs that center the health of their well-being and the well-being of their community and the planet. And so the Green New Deal really is a framework I see for accelerating our action, but putting people at the center of it. And maybe someone else can speak to the Just Transition framework, but utilizing a framework that acknowledges that our livelihood, our ability to survive on this planet and with this planet requires us to rethink the way that we are engaging with it. And so to Syris's point, it's about rethinking things like mining for minerals, extracting fossil fuels that support a variety of different behaviors that are contributing to the climate crisis. So all that to say, the Green New Deal is more than just an initiative or a framework. I think I would contextualize it as a movement of sorts that really builds on the work of organizers that have come before us, leaders who have come before us, Indigenous people, and it's a return to being in a good relationship with ourselves, each other, and the planet.
Thank you, Lylianna, for that. Basically, the just transition framework talks about we are and we should move away from extractive economy, with which centers exploitation and holding power and wealth, like Syris mentioned just now, into a way of doing business, living our lives through a regenerative economy. So keeping resources local and putting people at the forefront, valuing cooperation as versus exploitation in the extractive economy, and making sure people around neighborhoods, they have local produce to eat, they have housing, they have like meeting the basic needs, and approaching that way of living and economy with deep democracy.
When I think about the just transition, I always go back to the movement generation framework that they put together because it's just absolutely exceptional. So Movement Generation is an Oakland-based community organization that really does a lot of this work around the just transition and thinking about how we facilitate this, what it looks like, and what kind of projects can actually make this shift happen from the extractive economy that Joycelyn mentioned to the living regenerative economy, and sort of like what those key pillars are of both the economy that we exist under now in terms of like extraction, this sort of consumerism mindset, something that's based and driven a lot by militarism, because you need a lot of literal firepower to control the resources that are necessary for the kind of economy that we have. So yeah, facilitating that, and like she said, deep democracy at the base of it in terms of this living regenerative economy. So yeah, Movement Generation is somewhere that folks can go to get more information if they're really curious about the just transition. They're my favorite place to go for that resource.
Thank you, Syris. One of the things that all your conversations sparked in my head was just how, and I think it comes as no surprise, how interconnected all of these issues are, right? Meeting basic human needs is meeting the environmental needs. How do we actually tackle this very interconnected, like complex problem?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk more about regenerative agriculture and what that looks like. Just because it's a really good example of like one of the shifts that needs to happen in order to sort of go from this mindset and mode that we're in now, where we're constantly exploiting our natural environment, towards one that is focused on living more cooperatively with the planet and the beings around us. Where sort of in our current industrial agriculture model, where we're trying to sort of maximize the output of every single field in a given area, or the land that we have, you're basically planting it's called monoculture, so the same plant on a whole big field. So like in Nebraska, that's corn. In Washington, we have a lot of like alfalfa and potatoes actually here too. That's just like whole fields of just as one substance. And what that ends up doing is taking all of the nutrients out of the soil, really depleting it, not allowing for nutrients to go back into the soil and keep it healthy and in place. And it means that over time we're losing topsoil, we're losing nutrient value, our foods are becoming less healthy for us just because they're being grown on the same plot of land over and over again. And that's creating its own problem, separate from like the climate change that most people think about in terms of like carbon emissions and global warming. We're having topsoil crises that are quickly approaching, where like we're running out of soil to actually grow food. And the phosphorus in the soil is constantly being depleted and all these kind of things. And so what regenerative agriculture looks at is how we sort of take inspiration from thriving ecosystems and how they cooperate and have varying types of plants operating together in various modes, in terms of like some of them are really just like there to hold the soil in place and deposit carbon and other nutrients into the soil that then other fruit producing or flowering plants can then use to produce what we need to consume. And regenerative agriculture mainly thinks about one of the big other terms around it is like permaculture, as opposed to agriculture. So permaculture is about having things that are put in place there that are long-term. So like what's called perennial plants. So plants that you just plant once and then live forever, more or less forever, and just are constantly going through the cycles and don't need to be replanted over and over again every single year. And there's a lot that you can do with regenerative agriculture in terms of like drawing down carbon and putting it in the soil, which is one of the big things that we need to do at this point with the climate crisis, because it's not just enough at this point to just stop carbon emissions. We have to start drawing down carbon as well.
I can jump on that. Yeah, another method of thinking about this is, doing regenerative agriculture is crop rotation. So they will always have a plot of land that they plant legumes like peas or beans that helps fix nitrogen from the air. Basically what that does is we are putting nutrients back into the land that produces food for us. Another method is to always have a pollinator garden. I think Syris touched on that on your field. So that's important because I think 3 out of 4 bites of the food of the produce that we eat is because of pollinators' work. So taking care of them, right? Without pollinators, we probably will not have food to eat. So every field will have like a hedge, basically flowers that flowers all 4 seasons at different times for pollinators to support their ecosystem so that they can support our ecosystem. So it's like a symbiotic relationship that we have with Mother Nature.
I also want to mention, going back to your original question, how do we begin to tackle the problem? I think in addition to these solutions, we know that a large percentage of greenhouse gas emissions is coming from the transportation sectors and from buildings as well. I think this is really complex because it brings forth the reflection of what kinds of changes do we need to make to our system and to our culture and behavior in order to address the areas where the bulk of this problem is coming from. And it's so complex, right? Like it's about, going back to colonization and how, we've set up city centers and what we've prioritized in terms of the transportation of people and goods and services. And I think, it makes me think about things like how incredibly exciting the light rail stations are. And, now friends that live down south are able to visit their families in the north end of the city with ease. And folks who are living in the north end are able to easily meet up with folks that are living down closer to where I live. And I really appreciate that. I think that those kinds of investments and making plans in partnership with the community members who are using that infrastructure and who will see that infrastructure built in their neighborhoods is so important. It again is going back to a culture shift in terms of how we've always done things, and how we really need to rethink the way that we're coming to solutions. So I think it's challenging because I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago. And I grew up in an area where everybody drove everywhere. And so those are lessons that are ingrained in myself that I need to reevaluate and reassess and really call into question for myself in terms of, how do I want to live my values and how am I able to live my values? I know not everybody is able to do that. So I think that's very important to acknowledge as well, that the problems are complex, as will be the solutions. But I think for me, just going back to the importance of making sure that the voices of folks who are impacted most by the problem are at the center of developing the solutions is critical, a critical turning point for us.
I'm on the opposite, Liana. I grew up in Hong Kong where I took the train everywhere. I took the bus, and in fact, owning a car is very expensive, just super expensive. You probably get taxed 200% depending on the price of your car, and parking is expensive. Basically, what I'm trying to say is there are measures to discourage people from driving their own car using fossil fuels, but rather taking the train in a place that's so densely populated, which is another reason why that encouraged that. But I think we're also seeing Seattle, it's getting more and more populated. So I am super excited, and I do want to see a light rail station closer to my place too. Another point you mentioned is to center folks who are burdened by the consequences, the environmental consequences, at the forefront when making all these decisions. A very low-hanging fruit for local agencies is to compensate their time, please. I have seen that more, which is great. That's the step we need to take and move forward. Just making sure to compensate their time, and it's a fair compensation. It's not like a $25 gift card for an hour, because we are asking for their input and knowledge. So that is a very low-hanging fruit, or maybe create job pathways for them to continue working in this on this topic. I think what I'm trying to highlight is to make sustainable solutions easier for people to access, that communities or small businesses don't have to be punished for doing the good. They should be encouraged to take those environmentally sustainable actions.
Solutions like public transportation are so important to decreasing mileage from transportation, or decreasing carbon emissions from transportation. And y'all touched on so many good points. I'm trying to organize all of my thoughts and figure out what I want to respond to most. One of the things that came to mind, going back a little bit to what you mentioned, Joycelyn, about pollinator fields and growing sort of like wildflowers and whatnot, so the folks we can support our rapidly declining pollinator populations. A study recently came out that apparently in 8 of the 48 states in the contiguous United States, bumblebees have disappeared from 8 states, which is insane. Like, they're such a keystone and fundamental species for pollinating so much of our environments, and for them to be gone from 8 states, and I think most of these were down south, it's such a huge impact, and so important to make sure we're doing things to support those populations. And one of the things, as far as like bold action goes, one of the biggest things that needs to happen, and this is something that a lot of people aren't going to like, just because it sort of ties into the American dream, but it's unfortunately getting rid of lawns. Like, we can't have lawns anymore. Lawns are ridiculous and such a waste of resources. And it's to the point where, like, grass, just basic grass, is the most cultivated single like piece of agriculture in the United States, because we have so many freaking lawns, and we're just wasting water and resources and poisonous chemicals that then end up running into our waterways just to support lawns. And so one big thing that folks could do, and that could be mandated potentially or supported by policy action, is shifting lawns towards either like pollinator fields, and so planting wildflowers in and other forms of native plants in lawns, or shifting them towards supporting like community gardens and whatnot, and figuring out how, even if the person that owns the lawn doesn't want to garden, maybe they can partner with some community organization that is like a community-led like gardener or whatever, and then they can come in and use that land. That's something that I know some folks have done. There's some sort of like pilot projects that exist like that, where they're doing urban gardens on just like plots of folks' lawns that they weren't doing anywhere, you weren't using. And that's a very big shift that I think needs to happen. And also, Joycelyn, to your point about like the density of Hong Kong versus the density of like Seattle, or the average American city, like, we need to change our approaches to urban development towards favoring on the one hand, density, but making sure that these cities that we're developing are dense in a way that is healthy. Because like with a lot of cities, there's a big problem in terms of like having very densely co-located people, but not giving them access to like the green space that they need to have quality mental health. So making sure that we're doing that towards supporting that, and then also making sure that we're having sort of like not just green spaces for the sake of mental health, but also for the sake of dealing with like the urban heat island effect. So like with the urban heat island effect, that is the result of like having all this concrete and asphalt in one big spot that just soaks up all of the heat from the sun in very hot days and makes heat waves significantly worse. And so if you have a lot of plants and treescapes and even vining, like green walls, so vines on the side of buildings, that helps to reduce that heat island effect. And that's something that actually this summer we saw in particular is something that with the increasing rate of heat waves is particularly affecting BIPOC communities, like because we're in those areas that don't have a lot of green space, that are just basically just asphalt everywhere. And that results in anywhere from like 10 to 15 or even 20 degrees temperature difference from that to like a neighboring or nearby wealthier, wider community that has all those trees and parks and green space that can soak up some of that heat and help to dissipate it. And that's a huge change that we need to see in terms of how we're approaching the development of our urban spaces.
Oh, I'm just going to chime in because you touched on so many things that are very exciting to me. and one, I'll say, yeah, the benefit that trees and shrubs and plants that are endemic to this region provide for us are just innumerable. I'm definitely a plant nerd. I'm here for all the thimbleberry, all the vine maples and Doug firs. And yeah, to me, I think, this is something that I feel really deeply about. I don't think density means sacrificing quality green space. Just as you said, Syris, it's important for us to think about those things as both. We can have nice things. It's possible. We deserve it. and you're right. I mean, it's about supporting our health. It's about supporting our physical and mental and emotional well-being. It's about ensuring that we're doing our part to not continue to pollute the Puget Sound or our soil or our air. And the other thing I want to mention that you touched on as well, Syris, is that we're in a moment where we have to make bold policy actions. We're standing in front of the most challenging time right now. We have to make big policy sweeping changes, and not to say that we don't have the responsibility of individual action. I think that this is a both and everything approach. We're not in a space where the solutions lie in one sector or there's one kind of solution. We're at a point where we have to do everything, and we have to engage everyone. And so I think, sometimes we frequently hear the solutions couched within purely an individual perspective. And I just want to emphasize that we're at a point where we need to make big policy change, and that calls into question our very comfort with the life that we live for many of us. So I think, I grapple with it myself all the time in terms of, what are we willing to sacrifice, or what are we willing to invite in terms of a new way of being. Want to invite others into that complicated conversation around what kind. I mean, this is part of my job too, right? Like what are the policy interventions and changes that we need to make in order to ensure that our communities continue to thrive in place, and also save our planet and save our livelihood, and switch to more collective action.
So I come from a academic environmental science background, and I was always trained to believe that the solutions lie in science and lie in technological advancements. And ever since coming to ECOSS, I've realized that that's all important, But what's also possibly more important is all the relationships we build to come together and to be able to make these big, bold changes that are really lifestyle changes, not necessarily technological changes. Like we already have the science, we already have the knowledge, but it's what kind of policies do we need to change? What kind of lifestyles do we need to change?
And calling into question what we're investing in. I mean, I think that's the other thing. There's a lot of money on this planet that exists, and much of it is going to institutions that don't necessarily align with the world that we want to see and the values that we hold. I think that is a strength of where our grassroots community and grassroots power is, in terms of calling that into question and inviting accountability for all of us.
Yeah, and with the technology pieces brought to mind a lot for me. A lot of the sort of policy solutions that are being put out at like the national level by even the Biden administration are relying, in terms of like achieving carbon neutrality by 2050, are relying on technologies that don't even exist yet. And they're just like banking that these things will be developed. And in particular, they're focused on sort of the kind of what's called carbon capture and sequestration, where like you're trying to either at one of these like coal or gas power plants, or just from the air in general, you're trying to basically draw out the carbon dioxide and somehow capture it, whether that's in like some sort of like charcoal brick or something like that, and then bury it or turn it into some sort of product that can then be sold. And those things have barely been developed or proven. That they're at very low levels in terms of like their readiness to be deployed. But they are also these kind of technologies, the technologic solutions that a lot of folks are putting out and really like holding up to high regard. And in particular, I'm thinking about folks like Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates and Elon Musk. There are these solutions, these technologic solutions that allow for us, or assume that you can put those in place and then still continue to extract all you want from the earth, to build these like massive technologic empires that they have, right? And those just aren't actually sustainable at all. Like even if we were to, through the development of these various technologies, achieve quote unquote carbon neutrality, where we're pulling carbon out of the air at the same rate that we're putting stuff into it, if we're still pulling every single mineral and metal and nutrient that we can out of the Earth's crust, then at some point we're still going to have some other form of crisis. Even if it's not global warming and carbon emissions, there's still going to be something else that we're dealing with. Like I already mentioned, the topsoil issue and peak phosphorus is what it's called as far as the soil health is concerned. Both of those are related exactly to, or directly related to, our extractive agricultural practices. And technology isn't going to shift the way we extract resources from the planet and the land. That comes down to systems and policy change at a very high level.
You all mentioned this contrast between the big corporations versus the fact that the people in need are struggling with basic needs and are having to juggle that with their environmental health. What opportunity do you see for like being able to build these coalitions, build these relationships among the communities and businesses, small businesses, to be able to tackle these kind of issues?
I'm gonna jump on first. I'm hopeful and I'm excited to see people that actually believes climate change is taking over office, and you know, people in their 40s that they also believe in the whole climate crisis happening. Is they're starting to take upper management positions in large companies. So although they are still under huge pressure to, you know, hit certain profit margin goals or whatever, at least the proportion of those people in large corporations and in office are increasing. So I am very excited for that opportunity.
Yeah, I'll say there are alternative models to everything. I think I think about things like B Corps or cooperatives in terms of businesses. I'm not saying that that those are better than any other form of having a business, but just offering that there's different models that exist out there. I also think that I can speak to the work that I'm engaged in. There are some amazing folks that are in government that are trying to rethink, how do we change the system, and how do we do that in a way that is better aligned with our constituents and the people that we're here to serve, the communities that we're a part of, and that we identify as a part of. I think part of it for me is trying to dissolve the silos in some ways. It's not an us versus them. It's not a binary. It's a spectrum of engagement, a spectrum of identity, a spectrum of showing up. And for me, it's about showing up and showing out for what I believe in and for my neighborhood and for my community, and knowing that the work that I'm doing, I'm reminded by the stories that my parents told me and my grandparents told me around what it means to be a good person. And so those are things that I hold dear, but I think that the more folks are recentering themselves or realigning themselves in this way in different ways, I feel like we're reimagining the systems and the processes. We're doing it. And the one thing I want to point to is I guess I want to be cautious and say, like, I don't want to hang a lot of pressure on, different structures, but I deeply believe in the work that I'm doing right now in partnership with the incredible folks that are on the Green New Deal Oversight Board, the people that are on the Environmental Justice Committee, the grantees who we've been able to give money directly to, who are leading community-led solutions to environmental justice issues through the Environmental Justice Grant Fund. I think, and that's just the folks that I'm working with. Like this fractal goes out and out and out and out. And there's so many more partners that are doing this work and finding the intersections and seeing each other in this work. And so I don't know, I'm an optimist by nature. And so I hold on to the hope that there are people who are finding each other, these like sparks of light that are finding each other and gravitating towards each other, and really putting into action the power in numbers with regards to making systems change. So I think, I'll just point tangibly to the work that the Green New Deal Oversight Board is doing and all the different stakeholders that are represented there. But also holding that, I think, I don't want to speak for you all on the Oversight Board, but I think we know that our community is so much broader and so much wider, and I feel like all of us really feel the responsibility of widening the circles as best we can. And so, we're in the beginning of this work, but I'm so excited for us to continue to build together and see where this goes. And that's just one example.
Absolutely. And I also can't speak for the oversight board, but I can speak for myself. And like, I resonate with a lot of what you were saying, Lylianna, about like, there is a lot of power in like what we're doing on the oversight board and what y'all are already doing in OSC with like the environmental justice fund that you mentioned, and like all the work that's already happening there in terms of like putting money directly into the hands of community organizations who are trying to create and invent these solutions that are needed. And I think that that's where a lot of that sort of power lies, is using the structures that we have right now to help sort of put money in the hands of community organizations. And in particular, I think there's a need to make sure we're investing in coalitions of community organizations. So it's not about sort of like pitting one community organization against another and having this very competitive atmosphere that ends up setting each other back and not allowing for fruitful organic relationships to build and grow in our communities, because that's also what's necessary to support and allow it to happen. And so investing in community coalitions that are trying to directly address issues of climate justice, I think, is a really big issue. And when I say climate justice, to clarify, it's not just talking about like the environment in the traditional sense. It's thinking about these more holistic approaches that are about building like businesses and institutions that are owned and controlled by community, but have the added benefit of helping to sort of decarbonize our economy. Like I already gave a couple examples in terms of like regenerative agriculture, community gardens, and building the other sort of like supporting businesses and institutions that could allow for basically like a community food network to grow and emerge. And then also you can think about, one of my favorite things also is microgrids and community-owned solar power and energy production, so that we're not reliant on like these single holders of energy and utilities, but like communities can sort of be the owners of their own power, both in a metaphorical policy sense, but also like a literal sense of the power that generates our homes, owning the means of the power and energy production through microgrids and community solar, I think is really powerful path. And then there's similar things to think about as far as like community-owned car shares and having shared access to vehicles. So not everyone has to own their own individual vehicle. We can share and collaborate, because I mean, already if you own a car, 90% or more of your car's lifetime is literally just sat there parking. So why not have someone else drive it while it's just sitting there? And that's one way to both decrease emissions and also decrease the amount of raw materials that we're extracting from the earth, because you don't need to produce as many cars now. And I think that there's a lot of potential in terms of, and again, this is just my perspective, I think there's a lot of potential in terms of like using Green New Deal dollars and policies and programs to try to support building those, both building them out, the ones that have already existed. Like I know Seattle City Light is already working on one microgrid project. So how do we take that and expand it and do more? And then similarly, there's one community car share around an electric vehicle that's already getting started down in Duwamish Valley. Via Comunitaria that's doing that, and that's really exciting to see. Puget Sound Clean Air Agency supported that and helped them sort of like launch that initiative. So thinking about how we take things like that, examples like that, and then replicate them and build on those successes, and use that to put power and resources and then money in the hands of communities.
I have a few thoughts. So we touched on funding just now, and because I worked at ECOSS previously, from a nonprofit organization or community organization point of view, yes, investing in CBOs, very important. At the same time, make sure that funding is not like 5 months or, it's more long-term, so that people can actually do the work they want to do to bring forward those changes. Because I have seen multiple grants in the past. I'm not saying that we don't want grants, but I'm trying to say the funding needs to make sense, and it needs to kind of be proportionate to the work that we want to do, number one, and what's being asked to do. So, a lot of these community outreach work is not going to be done overnight. So I think funders kind of need to rethink how their funding structure goes. And I know there are a few local groups that are already doing sessions with funders to kind of rethink how can they equitably fund or change up the funding structure so that CBOs can actually get the real support that they need to for a long term. And another thought was, Syris, you mentioned examples and case studies from City Light and the car share in the Duwamish Valley. So it sounds like we are going towards a trend that's decentralizing these utilities, and that's great. Another example I just want to provide is I'm actually working with the Danuwu community gardens to locally manage their food waste, basically turn their food waste into compost. And so that's one way and another example of decentralizing our utilities and how we manage our society currently.
Thank you, everybody. This is all really inspiring conversation. Any final thoughts? Any parting thoughts you have before we end?
I just want to thank my fellow panelists here and just acknowledge that I've learned a lot from you all just in this time. And I think I just want to point to that as something that's central to this conversation as well, right? It's making space for learning, understanding, and making mistakes and learning from those.
I also want to say thank you, both of you. I also learned a lot. We really have to start, I think, government agencies, I think our local government is actually doing like ahead of others, but in general, government bodies they need to start actually caring and listen to people and be intentional with what they're doing. But at the same time, we kind of have a responsibility to spread the word to our family and friends too. And how do we make them care? How do we make them be intentional and make choices that can help us adapt to the climate crisis that we are facing?
Yeah, thank y'all too. This was a wonderful conversation. And I definitely echo and resonate with what both y'all said about like how much I learned from this and also how much there just always is to learn about this. And my, I guess, central takeaway from this is that there is, because this is such a global problem and something that affects all of us, we all have to be involved. But to Lylianna's point, it's not just about like individual little small scale changes. It's about thinking about how we work together towards achieving larger systemic goals and these larger changes that need to happen. And at the same time, I think that there is a place in this movement and this change for every single person to get involved, regardless of what it is that you're working on in your life, because this is so interconnected to every aspect of our society. So then it just comes down to about figuring out with what you're passionate about and what you're working on, how can you use that to affect positive change towards a just and sustainable future?
Thank you, everybody. I echo everyone's sentiments. Oh my gosh, I've learned so much and I really feel inspired. And thank you to all of you for having this wonderful conversation. And thank you to everyone who's tuned in. And I hope you feel inspired, as Syris said, to take action, whether that be learning about what actions you could take, supporting organizations that you love, or just spreading the word about how and why this work is important. With that, thank you. I hope you've enjoyed the conversation, and I will turn it back to our MC.
Thank you for joining us on the first day of the Sustainable Futures Fest. We hope you enjoyed hearing from our panel of leaders on environmental sustainability and justice opportunities in the Puget Sound region. For 28 years, ECOSS has been a leader in promoting environmental equity, working at the intersection of community, business, and government to elevate the voices of immigrants, refugees, and low-income individuals. As a nonprofit, we rely on donations to fund environmental education, technical assistance, and resources to small businesses, individuals, and communities. And we're able to do this because of people like you. Your support will help ECOSS continue this leadership to achieve just and sustainable futures for all. Please consider making a meaningful financial gift today. We value gifts of all levels. And remember to register for the daily giveaway at givebutter.com/ECOSSfest2021. No donation required to be entered for a chance to receive a $50 gift card for a local BIPOC-owned restaurant. Thank you for tuning in, and we hope to see you again tomorrow. Maraming salamat po sa lahat ng sumali at sana po magkita tayo muli bukas.